I'm Deirdre English, and so I also teach at the Graduate School of Journalism, which is one of the sponsors of this event. And along with Reed Schmidt, who's here somewhere. Is Reed here? Reed. Okay, thank you so much for your sponsorship. Appreciate it. So, you know, Geeta Anand is our new dean of the Graduate School of Journalism. She's the first time we've had a dean who's a woman of color, and she has a very progressive and far-sighted agenda for the school. She wanted to be here to talk with Rebecca, who's a graduate of our school that we're very proud of, and unfortunately a family emergency kept her away, and so I was simply asked to fill in, which I'm delighted to do. And I'll say why in a few minutes, but let me just, I've been asked to say a few things. So we get to not wear masks, but you all have to wear your masks. Sorry about that. Please wear them properly, I've been told to mention. And turn off your cell phones. And then I also want to mention that there will be book sales. And you can also buy these books on bookshop.org, sort of a preferred vendor. But if you buy them today, you can have Rebecca sign your book. And you know, the bookstores make a special effort to come out to this event, not to mention the authors. So it's a good way to, you know, recognize that. If you have a question, we're asked that you write your questions on these cards that I guess you have. I guess wave your hand if you need a card. And pass them over there to there. And then we're going to be given these cards to pick questions from. So, okay. Yeah, it's Green Apple Books is the bookseller. So I think I've covered my duties with that. And now I can say first a little bit about Rebecca Solnit. So besides being a graduate of our school, she's also the author of over 20 books, including the wonderful Recollections of My Non-Existence, in which she talks about having been at our school.
There's a theme.
Yes, I'll bring this up as often as possible. But other books, other of her more famous books include A Field Guide to Getting Lost, The Faraway Nearby, A Paradise Built in Hell, River of Shadows and Wanderlust, and the famous Men Explain Things to Me.
They do.
Yes, which popularized the great term mansplaining, which I'm sure we've all used many times. And many other essays on feminism, activism, and social change. And she's also a regular contributor to The Guardian, as was George Orwell.
Yeah.
And to the publication that preceded it and became The Guardian.
Yes, to The Observer, which is now part of The Guardian. And so one of the reasons I love writing for The Guardian, among many.
Among many, yeah. The Guardian is indispensable.
Yeah.
So I want to just start by saying that I really, really love this book. I just read it because once I found out I'd be substituting for Geeta, I already had it, but I kind of, I better read it. And so I'm so glad that I was put in this position and I just read it all the way through. And I mean, I tell you, I swooned. I mean, really, this book is like inhaling a bouquet of old growth roses, or, you know, old stock roses. And that's really, and the difference between old roses and new roses, as well as old speak and new speak, and many other old and new things are themes that run through this book. It's incredibly beautifully written. And you know, a real test of an author is if an author has to describe something that has been described so many times by so many people that it would seem to be impossible to be original. There is a place in this book where Rebecca describes first a photograph of roses, the famous one by Tina Modotti, and then moves from describing the photograph to describing the roses themselves. And it's such an original, fresh, evocative, beautiful, poetic description that you will die. And then it's also, sorry? I thought somebody was telling me something like that I wasn't speaking into the microphone. But I am, right? So anyway, when I first saw the book, I thought, okay, this is going to be a book about George Orwell. And I kind of expected, without thinking this, I thought, well, the rose part is going to, okay, I get it. He grew some roses. And maybe that's going to be sort of a decorative motif, you know, that'll be something to, you know, I don't know, a little bit of a metaphor. But no, this is really a book that is about roses as much as it is about George Orwell. It's very fully and entirely a book about roses, and roses in politics, roses in history, roses in industrial production, roses in our lives, the meaning of roses. So but it's also really a book about George Orwell as well. And it will illuminate so many things for you about him. So Rebecca has a way of writing, which she's famous for, which is, you know, somewhat elliptical. So as she says, she doesn't try to go the fastest way between 2 points, but sometimes the longest way between 2 points. And yet there's a structure to this book. I want you to know that. I thought of it a little bit as being like a trellis, that there is really a structure, which is Orwell's biography, and in a sense the story of his life, or at least from, it starts with when he plants the roses, and then it goes back and tells you about his early life, and then tells you his entire life by the time you finish the book and he dies. But his roses go on. But there's a trellis, there's a structure, but then the roses are just interwoven. Imagine a climbing rose, you know, on a trellis, where the roses are just interwoven in the trellis, and they're popping out in surprising places. And so that is something that I particularly admired about this book, and I'm going to interview Rebecca in a way that we agreed on, that is going to, I hope, bring that out a little bit. But just before I start my little lightning round of throwing you images, which we agreed I would do, would you agree with my description of the structure?
You know, Adam Hochschild said he thought the structure of the book was a rose bush, which I absolutely loved, because it has something central, which is the first, you know, and then it branches out in 7 directions. There's 7 sections. The book opens with a sentence: in the year 1936, a writer planted roses. And my discovery of Orwell's roses, still growing, allegedly his roses, none confirmed, you know, was kind of a wonderful shock, and made me look at Orwell again, one of the best known, most significant writers of the 20th century, about whom I thought everything to say had been said. He'd been important to me, and I knew his writing well, but not his biography. And as I read his diaries and letters, I found that nothing had prepared me for who he really was, which is somebody who enjoyed himself much more, loved nature much more, was much more passionate about gardening, much more involved in the natural world, much more joyous, and really kind of hopeful. And it was an essay where he talks about planting trees, planting fruit trees and roses, among other things, that had made me go to the cottage he lived in, I had moved into in the spring of 1936, and planted those roses. And so really the germ of the book is the shock of discovering those roses and discovering an unexpected Orwell. But I had also thought for a while that I wanted to find an encounter so resonant I could write a whole book that would be all the directions you could go from that moment. But I thought it would be an encounter between 2 people, or a person and a group, or some sort of thing other than a man and rose bushes. So it's really the same starting point for each section. Orwell plants roses, and then you go off and it takes you in all directions. And I'm glad you think it's beautifully written. I like to think that it's a lyrical book about fascism, totalitarianism, and flowers. Because it's about the roses. The roses themselves are political, as bread and roses, as symbols, as Tina Moddadi's subject matter, as she becomes kind of the partner of an assassin for Stalin and things like that. So the political is never absent, but neither is the natural. And it was really also, how can we think about all these things, Orwell, fascism, totalitarianism, et cetera, in a time where the climate crisis is the most pressing thing, and the natural world considered to be beyond, below, politics to be some kind of immutable, stable thing on which the mutable human drama unfolds turns out to be mutable too because of us. So it's not to pretend that Orwell cared about climate change, but to think in the age of climate change about the Orwell that was a naturalist, a gardener, an enthusiast for flowers, a person for whom the natural world is important and flowers are important even in 1984, even in his war reporting. And of course, Deirdre is a journalist, as I was trained as one. Orwell was one. So it's kind of nice that journalism school is sponsoring this. That it comes back to always, I think, the integrity that journalism is committed to of trying to tell the truth, get the facts straight, figure out what happened, use language in an honest and honorable way, things which Orwell was so deeply committed to. But I digress, which, as Deirdre pointed out, is all I have ever done and will ever do. I can't help it.
Well, nor should you. So I asked Rebecca if it would be okay if I just threw some images or ideas or phrases at her from the book, all out of order, and let her just reassociate to them, dipping into what she was talking about when she used this image or this idea. So I'm going to start with Stalin's lemons.
Yeah, one of the launching points for 1984 was Orwell in 1944 going to a freedom of expression conference in London during the war, at which a British scientist talked about the state of science in the Soviet Union, where Darwinian genetics had been termed bourgeois and suppressed, and instead this kind of bogus theory that you could bully plants into essentially that acquired characteristics could be inherited. Like if you work out a lot, your sons would be born with more muscles, and Lamarckian sort of pseudogenetics for those of you who know your biology. And Orwell was so fascinated with this next layer of the dishonesty, manipulativeness, and propaganda of the Soviet Union, the manipulation of data for political purposes, that it was a real spur. And that made me look at those controversies. And again, we like to think, oh, the natural world is political in our time, but it was in their time. Stalin had decided, because he bought the kind of social Darwinist genetics, which was a bunch of white, mostly British men suggesting that men are superior to women, white people to non-white people. The upper classes are the upper classes because survival of the fittest, they're just more, they're better, actually better. And so there was a bourgeois Darwinism, but it was, its own sort of capitalist propaganda. But Stalin rejected that, and he liked the Lamarckianism, which I think was also about his belief that you could build a new kind of human being and you could bully anything into anything. So Stalin's lemons was kind of a footnote to all that I became fascinated with, because Stalin became obsessed with he believed he could, through these acquired characteristics that would be passed on, force lemon trees to become something that would grow in cold climates, and began trying to force lemon trees to grow in climates like Russia that lemon trees did not grow in. So wonderful bit in Molotov's memoirs where Stalin's walking on, he'd make all his guests visit the gardens and admire the lemons. And, and I was just fascinated by the many things it raised. Stalin's, the genetics problems, the natural world as a political arena, as involves the Soviet Union and propaganda, and the question of whether Stalin believed his own lies, and et cetera. Did he actually believe he could bully lemon trees into becoming resilient? And were his terrified gardeners pulling trees out of the hothouses to kind of plunk in the ground and be like, this one's fine, boss. But he was deeply involved, and of course he was living like an aristocrat with many dachas in Georgia, the Crimea, and outside Moscow, and doing all this shit with lemon trees. And of course it's sort of a foil for Orwell's roses, Stalin's lemons.
And for Orwell's commitment to opposing the barbarism that comes out of lying to oneself as well as to other people.
Yeah.
And that's part of totalitarianism and
and it was interesting, of course, in the time of Trump, and now with Putin claiming Ukraine is a hotbed of Nazis as he attempts to assassinate its Jewish descendant of Holocaust survivors president, and all the other lies and propaganda, some of it by our own left, parts of it, thank you, going on about that war, to see not that Orwell particularly prophesied our time, but that which I think is the wrong framework, but that the problems of Stalinism, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, propaganda lies, and also the whitewashing in the mainstream capitalist media, are our problems in the 2020s as they were his problems in the 30s and 40s.
All right, ready for another?
Oh, yeah.
Toss you another.
This is like Jeopardy, except that it's my own book, which is... She's going to give me an answer. And
What if I throw one at you and you go, what? I don't remember that.
There is that thing when you've written a book a while ago where you're like, huh.
Yeah.
And somebody reads your book and thinks that you wrote it yesterday and wants to talk about it. I'm like, that came out in 2000.
Yes, I forget.
Yeah.
But I don't think you'll.
Fresh.
I think these. I don't.
It'll be okay.
I think you're going to be okay. I've been. So the River Orwell.
Orwell's real name was Eric Blair. He took a pseudonym maybe to spare his parents from what sort of left-wing things he was going to do, maybe because of his own ambivalence about what he was about to do as a writer. He published a little bit under Eric Blair, but very early on adopted it. It's also interesting because Blair is a Scottish name, and had all these horrible prejudices he gradually shed. He was a bit anti-Semitic, a bit homophobic, etc., and he shed them. And he was actually anti-Scottish, but the great geographical love of his life was a Scottish island. He spent as much as the last 4 years of his life on, and the Isle of Jura and the Hebrides. So Orwell is the name of a number of things in Britain, a village I have visited, and a river in the East Country and in the flatlands that's actually a tidal estuary. And the interesting thing is it has one name above the tidal plain, and then in the town of Ipswich, it changes names at that tidal place to Orwell. And it seems really likely his parents had retired out there, that's where he got his name from. And it also is interesting going to find this naturalist Orwell, who reminded me so much more of Thoreau, and not much has been written about this, but Thoreau, like Orwell, died of tuberculosis in his mid-40s, spent most of his adult life with death in the form of lung disease chasing him in periodic convalescences. And Orwell, as a champion gardener like Thoreau, a lover and careful observer of the natural world, and also a deeply political writer, they have a lot in common. So I loved it that he named himself after a river. I went to see the river, which will change dimensions with sea level rise, of course, because it may get shorter because of sea level rise, or it may get longer because the tidal saltwater incursion upstream into Ipswich may be going further upstream. So he named himself after something as mutable and fluid and complex as a body of water that flows into the sea, which I thought was quite wonderful.
It was beautiful. So, and you also use it as a bit of a launch pad to talk about Orwell's ancestry, or Eric Blair's ancestry, and who his parents and grandparents were.
Yeah, Orwell's great-great-grandfather had married the daughter of an earl, and the family was very proud of this fancy blue blood stuff. And the Blair who married the titled, aristocrat's daughter was entitled to marry into the aristocracy because he was very wealthy. He was very wealthy because he owned slaves and sugar plantations in Jamaica. And that there's a kind of whole botanical Orwell, and the biographies try and cover everything. So but they were written in an era where I think they wanted great men to be serious, and serious men don't spend a lot of time with flowers, and which are sissy. And I described to my friend Sam, who partly instigated this book, that what I was doing was pelting Orwell with sissy flowers. And, not that I think flowers are sissy or sissies are anything other than awesome. But there's a lot of botany in his immediate family history. So there's this ancestor, multiple generations who owned slave plantations in Jamaica, raising sugar. So there's sugar cane back there. And then his mother's father was also part of this sort of European imperial colonial monstrous project. His mother's father was a teak merchant in Burma, and his mother grew up in Burma. And then his father, who wasn't around for most of his childhood, wasn't around because he was actually an opium agent for the British government, aka an official trafficker. Although he was essentially responsible for bullying and dominating the Indian peasantry into raising opium for trade with China to cover the British trade deficit with China, which produced so many useful and valuable things and started 2 opium wars and etc. So opium poppies, teak, sugar cane, Burma, India, Jamaica. There's this really interesting geography in Orwell's near background that I felt was also part of the story and part of the complexity of Orwell. And I was a bit horrified to find myself writing a book about a dead upper middle class English white man, and tried to counterbalance by citing Octavia Butler, Ursula K. Le Guin, a lot of women of color and other voices. And one of the key ones was Jamaica Kincaid, because nobody, I believe, has written more brilliantly, passionately, or intelligently about the biocolonialism of gardens and flowers and plant names and etc. If you don't know her work, she's one of the great prose stylists of recent North American history. Came as a young woman from Antigua, became a staff writer at The New Yorker, and has written a number of novels and nonfiction books, and written these extraordinary essays about gardens. She's a passionate, highly skilled, and ambitious gardener, but one who never sees in it simply beauty. She wrote some of the best essays I've ever written about the politics of gardens. So I drew on her when I went into this kind of colonial history, and it was a pleasure to celebrate her brilliance and to let her be kind of a critic of what all this Anglophilia and imperialism meant and how it bore down on Orwell and his roses, which of course are partly Chinese roses. One of the many things Europeans got from Asia was Chinese roses that had mutated to become, what do we call them? Is there a rose expert in the house? I'm forgetting the term, but have long blooming seasons. And there's literally all these European poems about gather ye rosebuds while you may, because roses, I actually have an heirloom rose that blooms once and then is done, and it's blooming right now. It's very nice. And but those year-round, almost year-round roses, because when I met Orwell's roses, it was Day of the Dead, November 2nd, and they were blooming, are partly Chinese. So also to just trace the complex origins of all these things, of Orwell himself, of the roses.
And of Orwell
and the
himself,
rest.
yes,
So,
as you
yeah.
say. Yeah, because much as you love and admire Orwell, you are not uncritical, and you place him in a much larger context of his own origins as a son of empire and a beneficiary of empire.
And I think that coming from that background, he does become a great anti-imperialist. He doesn't love Gandhi, but he does believe India should be independent, is very aware, because as a young man, his family kind of hounded him into joining the Burmese, imperial police force, and where he resigned, as the one really stable job he had. Although at the end of his life, Animal Farm in 1984 sold well enough to make him financially comfortable for the first time since he left the police. But what he saw there turned him into an ardent anti-imperialist, and in many ways an anti-racist, very aware of anti-Black racism in the United States and these other things. And so he's complex, but he's also a beneficiary. I do think that a certain amount of confidence he had came from that background, from going to Eton, having this education not only in classical Latin and Greek, but hobnobbing with the sons, of the rulers of England who would become rulers in turn, and that kind of oh my God, the arrogance of Englishmen of a certain stripe is a whole other topic. And I think Orwell, who didn't go to university, spent a lot of time living among the poor, milked his own goats and hoed his own potatoes, was rebelling against it. But the confidence was there and the accent.
Yeah, yeah. Which, yeah, as you say, marked him as not one of the poor when he mingled with the poor.
Yeah.
I'm going to try another term on you from your book: buttered toast.
There's this one of the books that influenced me early on was Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. How many of you have read Homage to Catalonia? Oh my God, what a great crowd. And like most of you probably had to read 1984 and Animal Farm in high school. I might love Orwell more because I didn't go to high school. But Homage to Catalonia for me was so exciting because Orwell is passionately committed to defending the loyalist cause, and is willing to risk his life for it, and goes and volunteers as a soldier and lives in incredible danger and discomfort for months and months in the trenches of Spain. But he also does two things that I think are really interesting and exceptional, one of which is he's devoted but quite critical of his own side. He can write about the shortcomings and infightings and etc. And another is that he describes what's happening in this very empirical, experiential way. What is it actually like to have lice, to be cold, to be in the trenches? And there's this absolutely wonderful passage that I played with many years before I wrote this book, where the fascists and the anti-fascist side he's on are yelling propaganda slogans at each other across the valley. And it's like that kind of World War I, World War II thing where you're in trenches for long periods and the enemy, kind of relatively stable, trying to take territory. But the fascists would yell various things. And they had this wonderful guy on their side who sometimes, instead of yelling all the usual kind of left-wing loyalist propaganda, would shout, "Toast, we have buttered toast over here." And I absolutely love that. And you could tell Orwell did too. And it appealed to the fascists as human beings who might be hungry, who might have endured crappy food and cold and misery and lack of creature comforts. But it also, to me, said a lot more. It said, on my side, we're free to speak our minds, to feel our feelings, to describe reality as it really is, to, not just live in these abstractions. And one of the core principles of Orwell is his belief that one of the ways we don't get swept up into propaganda, into cults, into becoming good obedient subjects of authoritarianism and totalitarianism is to trust the evidence of our own senses, to be people who can bear witness, who can testify, who test things, who remember things. You can see the struggle of Winston Smith, the protagonist of 1984, to trust his own memories, to try and remember the past, as the regime consists in constantly revising it to their own convenience. Something you may remember from the former guy, who, at one point Winston says, water is wet, stones are hard, objects drop, fall toward the center of the earth. And it's like this kind of catechism of desperately trying to find something immutable in a world of swirling propaganda. So Orwell describes with great vividness. He's the kind of journalist who tells you what things look and smell and feel like and what he saw with his own eyes. He doesn't get lost in abstractions. And his novels are also very vivid that way. There's a kind of misreading of him that he's obsessed with bad smells. And I think he's actually much more broadly evoking the world around him, good smells, bad smells, etc. And even in the trenches, he describes peasants wandering along with wild roses the size of saucers tucked behind their ears, a cherry tree in bloom, and those wonderful cries of buttered toast, which kind of dovetailed nicely with the bread and roses in that other section.
Well, I'll throw you one not about bread and roses, but about the ugliness of roses.
Yeah. Now, so Orwell had gone in 1936. He has this extraordinary year, this real turning point year for him in 1936. he gets a commission in late 1935 to report on the poverty in the industrial north of England, a place he'd never been, and a kind of poverty he hadn't really seen. He'd been among tramps and hop pickers and kind of the equivalent of our SRO hotels in southern England. But the misery, deep entrenched poverty and the scale of it and the grimness of these landscapes of the mining and industrial towns was kind of a shock to him, and the subject of his book, The Road to Wigan Pier, Wigan being kind of a suburb of Manchester, went down into the coal mines, and this is where he kind of becomes an ecological reporter. He says how easy it is back when England, and to a large extent the US and a lot of the industrialized world, ran on coal, how easy it is to never think about the coal, to never think about the mines, to never know where all this stuff comes from. And he's doing this thing that I think we who've done environmental journalism and environmental advocacy are always trying to do, which is to reconnect in a world of alienation. And so that was one motive. And so he goes to the coal mines, then he moves to this cottage that allows him to live, to work, to stop having a day job and be a writer full time, plants this garden, gets goats, raises chickens, marries, and kind of has the life he wants, which he drops to then volunteer and go to Spain. So the three big decisions in 1936. But of course, this book is full of roses. And Orwell, I also wanted to go into Orwell's aesthetics. And for him, the ethical and the aesthetic are not separate. And it's something I think we deal with constantly, whether it's the nice manufactured things that are made by burning coal. And since a lot of what we own comes from China, and China is still getting a huge amount of stuff, of its electricity from coal, most of us are probably in possession of things on our persons right now in which coal power destroying the climate played a role. So the equivalent for me was something that I had long known about and wanted to investigate, this question of how do we think about something that might be visually beautiful but morally hideous. So I went to the rose maquiladoras or sweatshops or factories or plantations, whatever you want to call them, of Colombia. More than 90% of the roses sold in the United States come from these greenhouses, these huge greenhouses, like many times the size of this room in Colombia, grown in fairly ecologically exploitative conditions, but also utterly hideous labor conditions, like so many of the sweatshops around the world, from Bangladesh and Vietnam to Central America and South America. They figured out how to prevent workers from organizing, from having rights of tenure, disability, pensions, benefits, et cetera, by making them all hired temporary subcontractors. Actually, American industry did that a lot. I remember, and as white collar work, making everybody, an eternal office temp and stuff. So I have a wonderful friend from here, Nate Miller, who as a young union labor activist went and spent years in Colombia, became fluent, did a big report for Global Exchange on the flower industry in Colombia. It was one of the magical coincidences of this book that I happened to know the American who probably knew more about the flower industry and was more connected to the flower unions than anybody else. So we went to Colombia together. He was my guide. Nobody ever gets into those places because they don't really want you to see. But I wrote them a letter that made me sound like a nice American lady writing a book about roses. And their guard was down, and they did not Google us, which was their mistake. And we got in there and saw just these really bizarre conditions in which roses are factory farmed and were, and then the kind of sweatshop floors in which they're, processed, packed, shipped, and, just above freezing to, one of the shocking things. So you can fit 400 roses in one of the boxes, I think 5,000 of those boxes onto a 747. So every day, multiple 747s with all the fossil fuel emissions you can imagine are taking off with 1.65 million roses apiece for the American rose market. So buy your mother a fern for Mother's Day, for Christ's sake.
A local plant.
Yeah, or like bake her a cake or something. But I have not bought, those Trader Joe's roses and all those things. Also, this was one of the places that was supposed to be like green, whatever, insured. And it was like where they put a label on to make us people who want to be virtuous feel good, and it's all complete bullshit for both the environmental and the labor conditions. The places with those greenwashing labels are horrible too. So that was, a big, literally going further afield than anything else in this book, and that I actually went to Columbia, but it fit very much in with wanting to think about colonialism, about agriculture, about beauty and ugliness, and to see these roses and kind of fold them into this narrative, which you could describe as kind of a joint biography of Orwell and roses.
Beautiful.
Roses as flowers, as symbols and metaphors, as part of the plant kingdom that sequesters carbon and produces oxygen and made the plant far more than the animal kingdom did, and all the other things that flowering plants and the rest can be.
And regarding these roses as manufactured items, in a sense, a part of the global economy, you also, as you say, you find they've lost their scent.
Yeah, I know there are a lot of roses. You can also buy them in nurseries that are not bred for scent, and it is sort of disappointing. I love the Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco public rose gardens, and I love whatever the hell made people decide that roses were a public good that should be, a municipal offering along with other things, parks, swing sets, education, whatever, and. So, but it was one of the things that happened when I went to this rose plantation was they had a room where they were testing roses for longevity. We tend to think of roses as dainty and fragile, but as flowers go, they're pretty durable, which is why you can cut them in Colombia and, sell them in a supermarket in Wisconsin 10 days later or something. There's a lot of flowers that would never be that durable. So they had hundreds of bouquets, all labeled with the crazy, weird names they give them. In a very low-ceilinged room, and the shock for me was to be in a room that had probably several thousand roses in it, hundreds of bouquets of a dozen apiece, and virtually no smell whatsoever. With the kind of roses that Shakespeare wrote about, all that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, these roses didn't smell at all. And it was also interesting how, as a rose becomes a commodity, it's easy to grab something in Safeway that looks pretty, but you don't really smell, you're not really sniffing them in Safeway. And
Aesthetically
felt like
pretty
part of the
at
alienation.
best, yes,
Yeah.
but ethically ugly.
Yeah.
Well, I have many other terms I can throw to you, but I also want to get to questions. Do we have a fair amount of questions? 5 questions?
5 questions.
If people have more questions, send them. But before maybe I'll make this the last one, and then we'll
Okay.
go to questions.
Great.
But I have more if we have time. But I love this one. I want to hear you talk about this phrase, as the rose hip to the rose.
So, as I mentioned, I visited Orwell's cottage in Wallington in sort of southeastern England on Day of the Dead, 2017. I was actually looking for fruit trees for my friend Sam for a project he might do to see if the fruit trees Orwell had planted were still growing. They weren't, but the lovely people who lived in the cottage who Sam had written to invited me in. We hung out. And eventually, after I was disappointed about the fruit trees, they just casually said, "Oh, but his roses are still growing. Would you like to see them?" And just as we went to press, they threw some question into it. So this begat this whole book. But in a way, the biggest shock for me was to go back to 1984. As I said, I found an unexpected Orwell, and because I hadn't read his diaries and his letters and found this side of him, and even though I read most of the biographies of him, they give this side of him short shrift, but his domestic diaries and things don't. But the biggest shock for me, in a way, was to read 1984 again, because if you'd asked me before all this, I would have said 1984 is a very grim, gray, pessimistic book. I reread it after meeting this Orwell, this enthusiast for flowers, this kind of carpe diem guy who gathered his rosebuds and took his pleasures and took great pleasure in everything from Pulp Fiction to A Good Cup of Tea and English cookery to there was this artist who made these kind of raunchy postcards he wrote a long essay about. He loved Henry Miller. And Orwell enjoyed himself immensely from what I can tell. And he had a fairly grim view with the basis for it of the political situation and sometimes of not human nature, but of parts of the left, most of the elite, and etc. But rereading 1984 was an utter shock because it's a deeply sensual book, and the sensual, tactile, physical details are essential to the story. And literally the book opens with Winston Smith deciding to keep a journal. He's bought a beautiful old blank book in a junk shop and a place he shouldn't go. The lusciousness of the paper, the sensual pleasure of taking an old-fashioned pen to this creamy paper, and the kind of intellectual pleasure of putting down his thoughts, maybe for posterity, of trying to connect to a future he's not sure he can believe in, is literally the beginning of the book. And then he has a passionate love affair. He's had these dreams about the Golden Country. What also shocked me is how 1984 is not the bourgeois realism full of probability. Winston Smith keeps having dreams, and then the things in his dreams happen. He dreams of a woman making this bold gesture of ripping her clothes off in defiance of the sort of anti-sexiness, austerity of the regime. And lo and behold, it happens. He dreams of the Golden Country, and this bold lover of his takes him to a landscape they sneak to consummate their love affair that exactly correlates to his dream and is full of birds singing. He glories in the birds singing for its own sake. And then late in the novel, they start carrying on their romance in a rented room in the very junk shop where he bought the book he writes in, this blank book with the creamy paper. And he's also bought a little paperweight with a piece of coral in it. And Orwell wrote all these essays that I think the kind of austere leftists, one of whom wrote him and told him that flowers are bourgeois, would have thought were self-indulgent essays, trivial essays, beside the point essays. And they're really his warm-up exercises for 1984. He writes an essay about the pleasure of junk shops, and one of the things he describes is these glass paperweights with a bit of coral in them. And exactly that paperweight then becomes a key emblem for 1984. They keep it in the room where they're having this love affair. And 3 times in this room, in the proletarian district, where white-collar people, members of the party like Winston and Julia, are not supposed to go. Out the window, a broad, stout, red-faced, coarse-complected woman is singing in a beautiful voice, kind of one of the songs that they promulgate among the sentimental songs. And people often read 1984 as a very despondent novel because Winston gets tortured, he breaks down, he betrays his lover, he becomes kind of a broken man. But what Winston says over and over, and I think Orwell wants us to listen to him, is if there's hope, it lies with the proles. Winston does not believe that he's going to be the salvation, the revolution, or anything, although he does try to rebel quite unsuccessfully. It's a trap. I think this woman is where the hope lies. He sees her and thinks she could have been out there singing for 1,000 years. She's singing a song about lost love. So she's singing about remembering the past. She's hanging up on the laundry line washed nappies. So she's taking care of future generations. So she's this great, and just the way he describes her, she is a goddess. She's this kind of earth goddess who will endure, who seems immortal despite it all. And in the final scene, Julia has fallen asleep while he's reading to her from Goldstein's book of propaganda. And he sees her one more time, thinks once she must have been young and beautiful like a rosebud, but now she's like a rosehip, stout and sturdy. And then he thinks, why should the rose be considered, why should the rosehip be considered, why should the fruit be considered inferior to the flower? And it's a bunch of incredible stuff is going on. First of all, he's asserting that she's beautiful, which is not something any straight male writers were saying about 50-year-old stout working class women then, or maybe now, a lot. And then also, here's this guy writing the great novel against totalitarianism and mind control and propaganda of the 20th century, still incredibly useful in the era of Trump and Putin. And the key metaphor for his recognizing her is a rose. So maybe all that gardening all that browsing in junk shops was really useful for him to resist totalitarianism, to write this great novel. Maybe these things are connected. Maybe the small and large are connected, the big ideas and the little details. And that's really a lot of what drives this book, is those connections. So thank you so much. And do we
Beautiful.
have questions?
Yes.
And did you want to address the Alice? Did you want to address the Alice Walker thing?
Well, let's see if it's asked
Okay.
first, perhaps.
Okay. Absolutely.
Let's just see, but then we could. I would like to. And I'm told that because we got a little bit of a late start that we can go a bit later, right? Till 3:05 or 3:10? 3:05. Okay. So, okay. Oh, well, this one is perfect. This one, thanks to whoever wrote this one. How did getting a degree in journalism direct you in your future as a writer?
I was so lucky. As I said, I didn't go to high school. I went to college early, was on my own financially, so a bit financially desperate, kind of sprinted through, finished as I turned 20, realized I was still unemployable and extremely poor, or unemployable outside the pink collar labor I'm really bad at. I am your very bad waitress and sales girl, or certainly I was then. And so I realized I'd learned how to read getting a degree in English Lit, but I hadn't learned how to write. And MFA programs did not yet consider nonfiction to be literature. Creative nonfiction wasn't really a thing. And I kind of knew I wanted to be an essayist, and I was looking already at Orwell and Virginia Woolf and Pauline Kael, our homegirl from Petaluma, and a lot of these other people. And so I went to the School of Journalism, not really expecting to be a newspaper writer, but knowing that it would pull me, it would give me skills and things. And what I always think, and I learned a lot of very practical stuff. There was a wonderful boot camp quality about it. You know, I've been pretty productive. I say in journalism, but no journalist ever gets to say to his editor, well, yeah, I gathered up all the facts about the murder, but I'm not really feeling it, so you won't have it for the morning edition. So there was just a kind of like, just get it done toughness to it. Like one class in my first quarter was like, hey, class is dismissed. Go find somebody, interview them, write it up, and hand it to me by the end of class. You know, we did these drills. But what was most important of all, I think, and that makes me feel very close to Orwell and his passionate ethicalness around language, truth, writing, etc., is that I had an ethics class with Ben Bagdikian, but through every single class I had, and also my law for journalist class, there ran a thread of ethical commitment to tell the truth, to get your facts straight, to be careful, to have a sense that you owe your subjects, your readers, the historical record, posterity, to get it right. And there's a lot of great MFA programs teaching nonfiction, but there's also a lot of squirrely, wiggly stuff happening out there where people writing memoirs and other things make shit up, play fast and loose with the facts. I actually had a huge fight some years back with some other people about a book they thought was wonderful, was beautiful and brilliant, and it was very well crafted, but I thought it was an utterly evil book, not only because it was full of poisonous discrimination, but also because it manipulated. It wasn't like you can be Michael Ondaatje and write about Billy the Kid and Buddy Bolden, because so many people will write about them and he's clearly taking poetic license. But this was a book about something fairly obscure where the writer had reconstrued the facts to serve their own agenda in ways that were just untrue. And it was really interesting because these were non-journalistic people who didn't really have a sense that you don't get to change the facts about somebody else's life. You don't get to put words in their mouth. You don't get to say they said this at this time or to this person when they said it at that time to that person. So I feel like I was given a really good ethical compass, which is not to say that I've always perfectly lived up to it, but I've always tried to. And I thank the J School a lot for that, and I hark back to it a lot. And I think it's really important. I think you can do anything you want in language, but you have to be very honest about what you're doing. If you want to make shit up, call it fiction or put a disclaimer on it. But we do have a lot of fuzzy stuff out there, you know, and some of it is just, I think, I'm really loving Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, where he talks about why fiction can't take on climate change as a subject. But I think beyond that, a lot of nonfiction, because the novel has been so enthroned in literature, think that nonfiction has to read like a novel. So they have to remember the conversation their parents had when they were 5 years old and stuff. So they make shit up. And I do see a lot of writers writing memoirs and other nonfiction who actually will often say in an afterword or elsewhere, where like Cheryl Strayed's Wild, she said, I kept very detailed journals, which is why I'm able to recount in such detail. So I think that commitment to truth, which we all know from postmodernism can get very complex, but in a lot of ways is very straightforward. Either it happened or it didn't. They said it or they didn't. There's evidence or there isn't. And part of it also is you can write about things where you're not sure, where you know, my family history is full of stories of things that maybe didn't happen. I actually think if my grandfather wasn't really Trotsky's flag boy in the Russian Revolution, says more about us that somebody wants it to be true than if it was merely something that happened. But you have to be clear that, you know, there's no evidence that he was, for example. So that's some of what I got from journalism school, was that resourcefulness, but also I think a sense of integrity and mission and principle. So thank you, whoever
And
threw
it
me that
doesn't stop
softball.
you from writing beautifully.
No, and it doesn't limit, you know, you can go on and write poetry or whatever else. You just have to be clear to your audience about what you're doing.
Well, but I mean, even when you're writing this very fact-based stuff, you write
Yeah.
beautifully.
Well, thank you.
So I'm going to give all these questions to Rebecca. If we don't get to yours, she's still going to see what it was, so she's going to know what you were concerned about. So Orwell was disillusioned with both the left and the right in his lifetime. What would you suggest to him about that today?
I think the same problems persist. The right has often tried to claim Orwell, claiming by pretending that in being anti-Stalinist, he was anti-communist, anti-socialist, etc. Orwell's politics were more or less democratic socialist. I think he was kind of an anarchist in the William Morris tradition by nature. He didn't trust centralized authority, didn't like big cities, liked traditional ways, small communities, rural life, self-organization, etc. And of course, I said that those three things happened to him in 1936 as he became deeply enmeshed in the Spanish Civil War. He gradually realized it wasn't a two-sided war, the loyalists against the fascists led by General Franco, backed by Italy and Germany. It was actually a three-sided war. Stalin was backing the loyalists, but he was backing the communists who were loyal and or manipulated by him. And there were actually a lot of Soviet officials and agents in Spain running things. And they turned on the non-aligned communists, socialists, and anarchists. So it became a three-sided war. Since a lot of you have read Homage to Catalonia, you already know, but others may not, that Orwell had to escape Spain because he'd been with a party that was considered Trotskyist and therefore to be treated as the enemy. And in fact, the leader of the POUM, the Workers' Party he fought with, was tortured and assassinated, probably by Tina Madadi's common-law husband, who was an assassin for the NKVD, Stalin's international secret police. So Orwell was loyal to what should be the ideals of the left, but recognized a lot of people on the left betrayed them when they became either useful idiots who didn't fully understand Stalin and what was going on in the Soviet Union, or people who were perfectly fine with the gulags, the genocides, the ethnic cleansing, the torture, the suppression of poets and scientists and dissidents and etc. And that's very much a factor in 1984 in Animal Farm. Animal Farm, of course, being an allegory for how the Russian Revolution went wrong. And even in the current Putin-dominated Russia, people get in trouble for trying to circulate 1984. I heard from a Bulgarian woman a few weeks ago about reading 1984 in Bulgaria in 1985 when it was utterly illegal and dangerous to have a copy. So Orwell was devoted to what I myself am devoted to as left ideals, which would be universal human rights and absolute equality. You cannot support an authoritarian, whether it's Assad or Putin or Stalin, etc. I think, and be committed to human rights or inequality, because authoritarianism always violates human rights flagrantly and extensively in order to create a regime of terror and suppression and control. And so Orwell just thought the right and the kind of status quo of the England of his time was wrong and problematic, and that the left was these two different things. It's something I keep trying to write about, and I'm currently working on a piece for The Guardian again about. I've mentioned it in passing in Harper's, in this book, and other places, but I think we really have two things called the left, a kind of rainbow coalition left that is committed to universal human rights and equality and inclusion, a kind of big tent left that includes anti-racism, feminism, queer and trans rights, and a lot of other stuff. And then you get this kind of hard left that keeps falling in love with authoritarians and defending what feels like the wrong side and denying genocide in China, in the history of the Soviet Union, giving us some very interesting representations of what's going on in Ukraine, namely the Putin Russian version, etc. And, I could go on for hours because I've been watching it with alarm as part of our political landscape for the last several years. And of course, there's been people like Glenn Greenwald, who were thought to be the left when they started denying that Russia had aided the Trump campaign in the 2016 election. And Glenn Greenwald now is clearly out as Tucker Carlson's best buddy, and clearly a part of the right who defends the insurrectionists, transphobes, white supremacists, and other parts of the right. So it's a very interesting mess out there, and as a woman, I think some house cleaning is due. So, did I just use up all our time?
Oh, I think we have, if there's anything else you'd like to address, I think there's a few more minutes.
No, I think, if you want another question or if you want to go to that other business.
It's up to you.
I think we should air it in the spirit of Orwell.
Go ahead.
So
I agree with you.
So as some of you know, Alice Walker was originally invited to be part of the festival and then disinvited because she is both a supporter of David Icke, who's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, anti-vaxxer, and etc., and because of an quite dramatically anti-Semitic poem of her own. And I think both of us have very mixed feelings about what should happen, because we have a lot of respect for Alice Walker, a lot of awareness of the history of Black voices, particularly women's voices, being silenced, because Alice Walker has done a lot to liberate a lot of people and a lot of good in the world. And so I think, as you put it, there was no right answer what to do. Mm-hmm. And of course, we weren't involved in the decision, and we recognize what a difficult decision it must have been, with no easy or right answer, or one that would please everybody.
Mm-hmm. I guess I would only add that I think, to the credit of the Bay Area Book Festival, they've extended an invitation to Alice Walker with great respect to have an event with her as part of the Bay Area Book Festival, not this weekend, but at another time, with a lot of publicity, and have her interviewed on stage like this, where she would be able to talk about her latest book, which is based on her journals, and the 40th anniversary of The Color Purple, and her life story, which is an incredibly important and moving story, but also be asked about her embrace of someone who is really, without doubt, a conspiracy theorist and who's doing some damage, but give her a chance to respond to her engagement with that person, who she's given a lot of support to, and make it an open, free speech matter. Let people hear what she has to say and judge for themselves how they feel about it. So that is what the book festival has. They have extended that invitation to her.
I should say there was a certain amount of ruckus, and I think that Walker was portrayed as being anti-Zionist, and speaking for myself, I support Palestinian rights, self-determination, land rights, and et cetera. And I think the distinction here between anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic is significant because those two things are different. So.
Yes, and there were some people, it was a confusing dispute, and some people thought she may have been canceled because of her support for Palestinian rights. It's not the case. And it really had nothing to do with that. And the festival has a good record of having speakers who are in support of Palestinian rights, including at this festival. So there was, unfortunately, with something like this, there's a lot of rumor mongering and inaccurate information and fake news. But it's a bit of a heartbreaking situation, which again had no perfect answer, and which I think that however she explains herself around this one matter, I think that Alice Walker is a great writer and feminist who will go down in history as such. So, well, thank you, Rebecca Solnit.